The 992-911. We've got a crack at this car early on in its life cycle. So we get to see all the vast improvements that they've made to the interior space in terms of design, usability, layout, and modernization. So let's start going over that. Now this car is spec'd out to 120,000, but in Porsche fashion, you can tart this up to the limit. Leather dashboard, Alcantara, you can do embroidered seats, lower back tattoo, you name it, anything you want to do here, you can. Now let's talk about the fundamentals. Some of the things that have changed is the dashboard, the gauge cluster, and the center stack. Unlike the new Cayenne that we looked at, the center stack forgoes some of the touch and haptic and capacitive buttons that make almost no sense in a car like this. So this is all physical controls with the exception of a few, very few buttons up here. So your temperature is physical, your fan speed is physical, your rotary knobs for tuning and controlling the touchscreen are all just have this great tactile feedback. Your seat heaters and seat coolers are very easy to get to, and the core buttons that you want to use are all physical. Exhaust mode, your traction control, your damper mode, and of course your drive modes are a rotary knob on the steering wheel, and this makes this so easy to use and stress-free, and that's why it feels like a more modern yet throwback driver's car right from the get-go. The biggest thing to talk about is the instrument cluster. You have an enormous center tachometer with a digital speedometer. It dominates the entire space. With the car off, you're like, yes, this is all I need. And when you turn on the little fake key in the left-hand side and these screens come to life, you're like, wow, they've kind of carried over some of the traditional Porsche gauges in digital form. So on the left, you have your speedometer. You also have your temperature and clock. On the right, you can cycle through. You can look at a map, your drive modes. And the biggest problem I have with this is the screens keep getting wider and larger. And I feel like they need to make the steering wheel like this big now so you can see everything. The problem with this design is when you get your hands up here, the far right and the far left gauge are completely obstructed by the steering wheel in your hands. And when you cycle through and show the full screen map, you're basically, your hand cuts off and the steering wheel cuts off half the map. This to me is nonsensical, and I know they're following a tradition here, but this is definitely an oversight. But that to me, other than kind of the base audio system being really weak in here, is basically the only complaint I have about the interior space. Your pedal box, the usability of the core mechanical functions are great. The clutch is light compared to some of the older 911s, but it makes it way easier to drive. It's all about balancing all of the inputs in this car. That's what Porsche does. That's what the engineering side of Porsche does, is refines every edge. So I'm gonna do something now that I don't usually do. Let's talk a bit about the exterior. Now, one of the big knocks on the 911 is it's always looked the same. And traditionally, that's what they're trying to do. They are subtly making small changes to it every generation, but it's an icon. It's extremely recognizable, and that's one of the core reasons why even today, the previous generations are more timeless. They don't age poorly. In the case of this car, they wanted to do a bit of a throwback to the old 930s. And in terms of headlight design, taillight design, that's way more modern in the back than it used to. The LED taillight bar goes all the way across. It has a true presence at night, and in certain colors, this is still recognizable, but still recognizable as a new 911, and that's one of the best parts about this. But there is so much technical information to talk about that you are going to probably need a blanket. So let's head into the shop and talk about all of that.
So Mark, I'm happy because we're underneath the 911 Porsche Carrera S 992 generation, which is a recently introduced 911. And for once, we're getting one of these cars nice and early.
Yeah, where we can tell a story about it, unlike some of the previous ones where it's been like 15 years too late.
Yeah, we got to play internet historian.
Yes. So in this case, because of Luke at Porsche, we've been able to get every single piece of information you could possibly imagine. And I've never worked with an OEM before in the 5 years of doing this that could give you an explanation of why every single thing is done the way that it is. And whether you like the answer or not, there is an answer. And the only one that comes close is Mazda. So it's a huge deal if you love cars like this. But instead of talking about that, let's talk about this car because there is so much to cover here, Jack.
Yeah, so if you don't like technical segments, skip ahead because this is going to be a long one.
Yeah.
So let's start with the body construction and manufacturing process of this car because the 992 generation Carrera S reverses a trend in Porsche 911s. It's finally lost weight because that was a problem with the prior generation 911s. They kept getting heavier and heavier. This is now 5% lighter than the 991.2 Carrera.
And a huge reason for that is the use of aluminum has gone up and the places where they use aluminum. So one of the biggest changes is the side stampings where the door sill is all the way back to the recorder used to be steel. Now it is a solid piece of aluminum sheet metal. So it's changes like this and the clever use of different materials like the roof architecture. The standard roof is aluminum, or you can get magnesium, or you can get carbon fiber reinforced plastic.
Or glass. In the manufacturing process, they now use roller hemming, punch rivets, and high friction welding, which they didn't use before. So this is now on the MMB architecture, which is Porsche's global sports car architecture, which means the 718 and the 911 are both on this, which means they can either make it mid-engined or rear-engined.
And the flexibility in manufacturing allows them not only to save money, but also make it more efficient because you can do 2 platforms and 9 different variations of those 2 platforms on one assembly line. And, if you're making a sports car that's low volume, you don't want to have, 1,100 employees like tinkering over everything. So consolidating that, getting things more efficient in the plant flow process is partly why this generation has gotten so much better as well.
Yep. So with that, let's talk about the suspension and chassis design.
All right.
So Mark, the first thing they did with the chassis tuning is the wheels. They now have a staggered setup, front and rear, meaning the fronts are 20s, the rears are 21s. The reason they did that is because it increases tire temp stability as well as increased linearity and dynamics, and that's the whole purpose behind the 911 and their chassis tuning. Every single time they modify this car, come out with another generation, they want to hit their core, basically engineering targets, which is comfort and performance and that balance.
And that is a tricky thing to do with a sports car. In the 911, this 911, the Carreras, and the 4S, this is about finding that harmony between not going too far on any angle. So like this under panel, right? This is a special coating that allows for lower NVH, so you're not, deafened inside the cabin from road noise. They're trying to do just enough with damping, tire technology, all of that to still give you some connectedness, some feel like you're driving the car and that's not just driving you, but still making it livable every day. And that's one of the hardest things. It would be way easier to strip all this off, to strip all the dampers and vibration dampers and frequency isolators and hydraulic dampers and just make it a bone-crushing connected experience. That's easy to do. Turning this into what it is way harder, and that's why the 911 keeps evolving, and it's always been, and it's even more now the benchmark car for this type of thing.
Yeah, and on top of that, Mark, not only did they do a different wheel design, they now have different tires, which are bespoke and specific to this 911, which will show the tire chart what they were trying to accomplish, but their big thing is wet weather capability. And on top of that, they've combined the way PASM and their Porsche Stability Management, PTM, work in combination with these tires and the air brake in the rear to reduce braking distances. And yes, you have carbon ceramic brakes and these steel rotors, but it's pretty substantial. About 100 kilometers an hour is reduced by a meter, but at 180 miles an hour, which is 300 kilometers an hour, it's down by 12 meters.
And believe it or not, and we don't talk about this enough, but tires are a part of the suspension design. And you might think, well, you can throw any tire on here, but when they're doing damper tuning, spring rates, all the electronic control systems, this compound is a very important part of how all of this works together. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a better tire out there. Obviously, you can put in your R compound tire on this and have more grip, but then you sacrifice some of the tuning that they've built into.
You'll introduce more roll, all that other fun
road
stuff.
Noise, all that other stuff. But this is definitely integrated. This compound is integrated to how they tune the suspension and chassis.
So with that, Mark, you want to talk about PASM, which is Porsche's adaptive dampers.
Yes, it's just a fancy name for adaptive dampers. And they use Bilstein DTX, which is what it looks like, a strut. They have a strut front suspension with aluminum knuckles, mostly aluminum components. And they're able to use this strut suspension. They've used it for a long time. They're still able to get the camber angle, the adjustability out of it while still maintaining good steering feel, good connectedness, and a lot of it is in damper technology. So what they're doing now is Porsche does all the software in-house for the DTX, the electronic control of the dampers. And the main thing that they've done with this generation, and part of it is the mechanical design of the shock, they can go softer and they can go firmer. And we're going to show the shock dyno because they supply this, assuming that it's not
made up.
That's not fake news. But when you look at the charts compared to the previous generation, it gives more flexibility between normal mode and kind of sport chassis. And that's the kind of two damper settings they have, which is normal and sport. That's it. But of course, the dampers are always varying themselves. And we had this discussion today about how the car is even able to read ahead based on what trim level you have with all the body sensors. It knows GPS location, it knows temperature, it can know the road in front of you.
Elevation, all of that fun stuff to tune this car to best suit you. And that's, again, when you have VW Audi Group money, you can do this.
Right.
And then on top of that with the suspension, you have what Porsche calls their four-dimensional electronic control unit that controls everything that has to do with suspension. So that's torque vectoring in the diff, that's rear steer, that's PDCC, which is their adaptive sway bars, which help reduce and mitigate body roll, and the adaptive dampers. They all now go through one system that helps improve this car get around the ring by about 5 seconds faster than the prior generation Carrera, which is negligible. But more importantly, the car rides better than it did before, and it's far more predictable.
And that's the important part. Times are, you can't really measure that, but what it feels like is that makes a noticeable difference on the everyday use of this car, and that's what's very important about when you're designing this.
The next thing to talk about, Mark, and this has been an issue with 911 since they've gone to EPS, is the steering system. They have done everything they can to revise the 992 steering rack and steering electronics to be as linear and as progressive feeling as you can possibly get a car, and it shows. This is probably my favorite EPS unit. And with rear steer, this car is about 6% more direct than the prior generation. However, without rear steer, it's about 10%. And the way they've done that is?
Well, they have increased they changed the torsional rod or torsional beam, and the EPS unit is largely a carryover. So a majority of this is software. It is a variable gear ratio steering rack, and it can change its ratios. So like you said, if you have rear steer, it's quicker than if you don't have rear steer. So the change, the biggest change is to get to 180 degrees. Your turn in from 180 degrees either angle, it's quicker to get to that point than before. There was a larger ramp in the previous generation. And again, they show a diagram to kind of explain what they're doing there, but most of this is software.
Yeah, and this is the actually same steering rack that's now being carried over to the Panamera and the Taycan. The last thing to talk about from a chassis standpoint before we head to the back is their drive modes. And they integrate basically every subsystem possible into these drive modes. But the most interesting one is their wet mode. So there are water sensors in every single one of these wheel wells that when it detects rain, it warns the driver that you're about to experience a brown pants moment. So it pretensions the ABS and the stability control system to mitigate some of that and warns you to put it into wet mode, which then activates your air brake and dulls the throttle response. And if you have the 4 or 4S model, sends more power to the front of the vehicle.
And part of that drive mode selector, you need a chart to break down really what it's doing, but it's looking at 4 categories. You're looking at whole car, drivetrain, chassis, and electronics. So each subcategory, the drive mode selector is changing something in each. And progressively, as you go up from kind of normal all the way to Sport Plus, there's some things in Sport Plus that you would think that'd be in Sport, but it's flipped. So the main thing to talk about is Sport Plus is the most aggressive for launch control, for throttle sensitivity, pre-building boost and holding it so it will close its wastegate off. There's a lot going on here that's not just like throttle sensitivity change, we're gonna ramp up the steering. This is changing effectively the entire car through the drive modes. And it's one of those things that happens all in the background. You really don't know what's happening, but it just works. And that's, from a driving perspective, that's one of the most important things. You're not distracted by it. You turn it what you want and you just drive. But the other thing that it does do is the sound symposers. They are pumping in induction noise from the engine through the back half of the car. And in Sport, it's opening up 1 valve, and in Sport Plus, it's opening up 2. So it creates this like sonic, almost stereo effect from induction that you typically don't hear, and we'll talk about that on the drive. But even those modes affect that. It's not artificial, well, it's not digital engine noise.
Yeah, they're not coming from the speakers.
And that's the first thing we asked. So I think, let's head to the back and we can cover pretty much everything else.
All right, Mark. So Mark, the first thing to talk about when it comes to powertrain is actually the motor mounts. They've changed them for this generation 911. They pushed them outward and forward, which leads to more engine stability and rigidity in the relationship between the motor and the transmission, as well as the fact that these motor mounts are hydraulic and are affected by the drive modes, which we talked about earlier.
They are active. So it's just unbelievable when you get down to the nuts and bolts how much work has to go in engineering to make this, to give it all the performance you want without really feeling like it's there. And I joke around with a lot of people, just put on some hard poly mount, engine mounts, and you could do all that and then nobody would want to drive this thing. So it's the ability to use the technology, the drive mode selector, to give the engine a little bit more movement under throttle and acceleration in the wet. To give the suspension more give, to make it more compliant, more pliable, and make it more completely usable in every condition that takes so much work and time. And that's where you start to appreciate a lot of what goes into this.
The nice thing about Porsche is that they have money and their customers have money.
Right,
and
yeah.
Because they have the resources, they don't have to chicken shit bullshit around with half-ass implementations of things. If you like cars and you like engineering, this thing is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean it's going to be for everybody and it's perfect. There's certainly cars that do things better than the 911 in certain areas, like performance or theater, right? This can be viewed, to me, in a lot of cases.
Well, Germans don't have a sense of humor. Their version of a sense of humor is to like this. But it does everything well. So moving on from the motor mounts, which again, because they're more rigid, add some performance benefits, but also keep the NVH out of the cabin by reducing the engine chugging effect when you're putting this thing under too much load. Well, the next thing to talk about is the motor itself. This 3-liter, which is the same displacement as it was before and is largely similar, has been revised pretty substantially for the 992. The first thing to talk about are the turbos. The turbos, which there are 2 of them, now have bigger compressors and turbines. And the benefit of that, combined with the new exhaust manifold design, which is now cast iron versus steel, is that the turbos spool up faster, there are less emissions, and then on top of that, the catalytic converters heat up faster.
And to try to do all this packaging back here is just crazy to me. When you look at the exhaust, where you have to fit the turbos, all the things that you have to meet in terms of regulations, emissions, sound, all of that, it's just a ton of work. And then combine the fact you got to keep adding more because you want upper trim levels. You still have to fit more and more in here. Like this car has rear wheel steering. And then you get into the vehicles that have the adaptive sway bars or adjustable sway bars that are electronically controlled. So
or the 4-wheel drive system,
right.
Or the fact that this is the same architecture that has to fit the upcoming GT3, the turbo model that's already out, the GT2 RS, the Money I'm Rich edition,
right.
All of these things. And this is it's a complex platform. On top of that, yes, this motor now makes more horsepower. It went up to about 450 horsepower, which, quite frankly, is very underrated.
It's got to be, at least, unless this is a ringer. When we're going to do the drive, that was the first thing I thought of. I'm like, that number is so misleading.
It feels like 500.
Yeah, it feels like over 500 to me. But, that's credit to be given. Some of that is engine tuning here.
It's consistent, and it feels the same every single time. And the way this thing builds power, we talked about in the first 911 we did together in the 991.2T, Porsche's philosophy behind this motor is to make it feel naturally aspirated. It doesn't, but it does build power in an NA fashion. Yeah. So it winds all the way out to redline, and it feels great doing so.
They want everything, and that's why this car is so good. Their focus is how do we balance it all, and that's the end result of the 911.
And then they revised the cooling system, specifically the intercoolers. They're now moved from the outside of the engine, from the left and right side, now to the center part of it. So again, it's more thermally efficient by I think like 12 or 15%. And because of that, you can run more power, and then you have the active front shutters for the coolers. This car in that front is very, very impressive.
And this car, in terms of aerodynamics, that's something we really didn't touch on too much, but it's been improved here. This car was designed and integrated into wind tunnel testing, so coefficient of drag, flat underbody, the panels, the way airflow moves around the corner of them, the flat door handles, which don't go in like Tesla where you have to dig at them. It pops out but goes flush. It's a very elegantly done. Again, that doesn't stand out or scream at you. Nothing screams at you here as being in your face or boisterous. It's just understated. Everything about this.
The aerodynamics do two things. Obviously, increase fuel economy, that and combined with their new injectors that they've added to this motor, help with that, help in that fashion, and also help when you're on the track. And let's talk about the last thing. It's kind of the elephant in the room, the transmissions.
Okay.
So Mark, this car comes with two different kinds of transmissions. You can get a 7-speed manual, which the Carrera S and 4S have. You can't get a manual on the regular Carrera anymore. And it is basically a direct carryover from the 991.2 generation car, which means thankfully it still has 7th gear lockouts. Unlike in a Corvette where you can go into 7th gear whenever you want, you can only go into 7th when you're in 5th or 6th, and that stops you from missing 5th or 6th. And the next thing to bring up, and this is really the all-new part about the 992, is the new PDK, which is now an 8-speed versus a 7-speed. It reads the road ahead, much like the suspension, to determine what the best gear is to be in. It knows if you're in a city, it knows if you have adaptive cruise control, if you're about to come onto a car that's coming up too fast, to preempt the right gear. It's very sophisticated and very impressive, and it fulfills the subtle design requirements that Porsche needs, where it improves everything by a little bit. And this is a modular transmission as well, which means it'll find its way into other products that Porsche is making. And on top of that, the pumps inside the PDK are more efficient than they used to be. Both the oiling pump, to basically deal with thermal efficiency of the trans, is more efficient by like 33%. And the oil pump that comes directly from this dry sump motor that feeds oil into the transmission as well is also more efficient by almost 77% to deal with less internal losses. The last thing to come to terms with when it comes to the powertrain are the differentials. So the PDK gets an E-diff, which I know I have problems with the E-diff, but it's supposed to feel very natural. And the reason why the PDK is the only version that gets the E-diff is because they are basically conjoined, and they need, the E-diff would only work with how quick the PDK shifts. The manual, which this car has a traditional mechanical differential, which still, with clutch packs, which still is integrating the torque vectoring system in the rear.
Yes, some of this is electronics too, with the differential control. The PDK is insanely fast. So to get the differential ready, to have the electronic control of being able to kind of preemptively and proactively engage or disengage clutches at a specific speed, it just makes more sense that it's there. But with a manual, you know, you don't need all of that, because there's no way a computer can predict, well, when's this asshole gonna shift, or, you know, or pull a money shift or whatever. So it's interesting that they have those two things there. But other than the transmission logic and all of that, what else do we have to talk about?
Really, I mean, this car is not their highest performance model. It's not going to be the fastest one. It's supposed to be all things to all people, and it does make that difficult. However, to give you a little bit more flair, you do have two exhaust options. It's the last thing we're going to talk about before we hit the streets in this 911, Mark. This has the sport exhaust, which is a dual tip, you know, muffler design with freer flowing mufflers, or a freer flower muffler, which is active, and you can get some burbles and pops when you're in sport mode, and that goes away when you're in Sport Plus. Or you can get the quad tip exhaust, which is the standard Carrera S muffler design. And all of them get Porsche's new particulate filter, which doesn't really make a difference to you and I, but it's a form of basically them trying to clean up the exhaust a little bit.
Okay. So I think there's probably way more to talk about, which we'll be covering more 911s in the future. And I know we've been promising a GT3 of multiple generations, so we'll get there. We'll explain all the rest of the nuances, but let's get this out on the street.
All right, man. So Mark, we're in the Carrera S 992 generation 911 with this 7-speed manual. And before we talk about the dynamics of this vehicle, I want the viewers to experience this drivetrain.
Man, is that fast. Holy shit, dude.
Now, I know this on paper does not have the power of the AMG GT or Aston Martin Vantage, but you tell me, honestly, with a straight face.
This is on another level, dude. This is on another level. I mean, when I associate the previous generation 911s, the Carrera S's, this is incredible, dude. Oh, man.
And you pair that with this gearbox, and yes, the shift action isn't the best, but the pedal box is spectacular. It's easy to heel toe, and if you don't know how to do that, it'll rev match for you when you leave stability and traction on.
And it will even, if you stall it, all you have to do is push the clutch and it will restart the car.
The gearbox in this car is so good that, yes, I know the PDK is amazing. Everyone talks about it. There's almost no reason to get it. And it makes for such an enjoyable driving experience. The motor itself, yes, it feels naturally aspirated, but the way it delivers power is linear, and it winds all the way out to the 7,500 RPM road.
One of my biggest complaints about modern turbocharged engines is you lose the drama at the higher end, and this car picks up so much sonic just ambience from this engine as you wind it out, and partially it's because of the tricks they've done with induction tone and piping some things in, but when you get near that red line, it's like this thing just vibrates and sings, much like what makes the GT3 naturally aspirated engine so exciting. There's a lot of that here, and then you have the torque and the thrust. This thing feels incredibly fast, and I'm just floored by how good this car is.
Before we talk about the dynamics, I will say this. Yeah, I'm a Porsche snob, but I love the Vantage and all the Aston and the AMG GT. For my money, I'd buy this car because it does everything brilliantly, and we talked about that in the shop segment, but I guess the next thing to talk about is the suspension tuning and the steering. I know people bemoan the lack of hydraulic steering in Porsches,
right,
but the revisions they've done to this generation 911 make it basically imperceptibly different from the 997, and we just drove that car.
Yeah, and this is the other thing, having the ability to go back to back to back with all these 911s, how good the hydraulic steering is completely overblown when you get into the 992. This is you feel everything you need to feel from a road car, and there's literally no trade-offs to doing it. There's nothing that's too hardcore here, with the exception of, I don't know what you're going to do with all this power. It's so fast. Jesus.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And then on top of that, not only do you have some of the best EPS in any modern sports car I've driven, you have about as good as you could get a truly sporty car to feel as a street car when it comes to suspension tuning.
This is just at that cusp of being just firm enough to handle high speed, to handle really high speed maneuvers in terms of cornering on the street, and while maintaining all the drivability that you want. I could drive this, most people could drive it every day, and if you close your eyes, you'd never really think that you are in a sports car, and there's so much work that Porsche does pretty much the best job out of any manufacturer at blending the streetability of a suspension system over bad, soft, every type of pavement, while still giving you the ability to get through these corners, stay flat, stay confident, and have a ton of overhead. At least enough overhead to go out on a track and enjoy this if you wanted to.
Yeah, I will say that it doesn't load up quite as naturally as the 997, but it masks your mistakes in a way that the older car just cannot do. And the rear steering, combined with how direct the steering is in this car and how sophisticated the PASM active dampers are, it's really impressive.
Yeah,
yes.
it's just a lot of this is software, right? A lot of this is software tuning, and I think they've refined it to the max. And I think what this tells me is this is a car that is approachable to somebody that is not a hardcore like track person. It gives you confidence, and there's still enough here for somebody that loves to drive, that is highly proficient at driving, and it's for both people, and that is impossible to do, almost impossible to do. We never see it.
Yeah, you can get it to rotate under throttle, rotate under braking. It trail brakes brilliantly like all Porsches do, but it isn't scary. It doesn't want to step out all the time, and it complements the driver in a way that few cars can. But the reason that they can do that, and we talked about it in the shop, is Volkswagen Audi Group Porsche has the money to engineer a car like this. So,
yeah, I think everything else that needs to be said can be summed up in the final thoughts, Jack.
All right, Mark.
Final thoughts on the 911 Carrera S. This car surprised me. I am not somebody that is like, oh, 911, it's the best thing on the planet. And I come at it from a much more objective place. And driving the previous generation 911s, I've always had this kind of ambivalence towards the car. This is different for me. I feel like they finally found some of the magic blend of making the interior feel special. Things like I talked about in the shop, door handles that still integrate into the door, but they pop out and are still usable. The interior space doesn't feel ultra generic. It's still functional, however. They've left a lot of the physical control structure. Yes, there's piano black. I don't get it. Yes, there's some complication with the gauges and screens, but the infotainment works. All the electronics work as best as you can possibly expect in a modern vehicle. Combine that with the fact that this ride's amazing. Just doesn't matter when, how you're driving, fast, slow, on bad pavement, if it's raining, if somebody dropped a porta potty on the ground and you had to slide through that, you always feel in control and stable with this car. And for the first time with my experience, the manual transmission, yes, the shifter is a little plasticky on here. That's about the only negative thing I can say about it. The pedal box is great. When you're going at it, when you're driving this hard, it has the performance out of the box that feels like a supercar. The engine performance, the way that it builds speed, the engine tuning, the steering, the braking, all of this is in such a harmony that doesn't make this feel like kind of the cookie cutter 911s of the past. It's enough for somebody that wants more, like me, and somebody that still loves the 911 as a brand. They've carried it all over here about as perfect as you can make it. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next video.